Hello and a warm welcome to this World Economic Forum CNBC Africa special broadcast coming to you from our studios in Johannesburg, South Africa. I'm Bronwyn Nielsen. Just over 3 weeks ago, the World Economic Forum released its outlook on the global agenda for 2014. This yearly report collates the opinions of over 1,500 global voices from the forum's networks in order to indicate the emerging trends for the year ahead, as well as to map the connections between them. The trends have both a global as well as a regional impact. Over the last 2 weeks, CNBC Africa has travelled the continent to unpack the trends most relevant to the respective regions. In Lagos, we discussed the two trends that had the biggest impact in that West African region, namely persistent structural unemployment and growing income disparities. We also discussed the role of entrepreneurship in empowering the youth population. We then moved to the east, to Nairobi, where we spoke about intensifying cyber threats, the rapid spread of misinformation online, and how the ICT agenda could alleviate unemployment in the East African region. Today, we travel to the southern tip of the continent to bring you the final edition in this three-part regional discussion series. For Southern Africa, we delve into the two trends most relevant to the region, including diminishing confidence in economic policies and the perceived lack of values in leadership. Joining me in studio to unpack these trends are Colin Coleman, Managing Director, Goldman Sachs Sub-Saharan Africa; Nkosana Moyo, Founder and Executive Chair of the Mandela Institute for Development Studies; Ashish Thakar, he's Founder and Managing Director, Mara Group; and Matsi Modise, National Executive Director, South African Black Entrepreneurs Forum. We're also joined by our studio audience in today's discussion. Thank you all for joining me. Well, let's look at the top 10 trends. And I think that this report is important in that it sets the stage for the next 12 months. What do leaders both in government and the private sector have to deal with to ensure stability across not only the regions but across the globe? Now, the number one concern out there at the moment is obviously the rising tension in North Africa and the Middle East and the impact that that is going to have on the global economy over 2014. Matsi, let's bring you in first in terms of what you've noticed in that trend on the ground.
Well, it's clear that a lot of people are not happy. And it's clear that there's a lot of structural misconstructs within a lot of policies. And the youth are screaming, they're shouting because something has to change. Africa has a majority of its population as the young people. If we have to have an outlook, it's very, very important to hear what the youth are saying. Youth are unemployed. Youth are not seeing that, we have a greater future. It's different in South Africa. However, we do have 50% of, our of the young people being unemployed. It's a structural issue, but it's very, very important to understand that the government has to listen. The leaders have to do something about it.
Absolutely, and obviously we're referring to the rising tension in the Middle East, North Africa. Colin, if you could give me some context around whether that is a concern for you as one of the global business leaders.
No, clearly the Middle East, North Africa issues are a geopolitical issue, and it certainly impacts energy security. It impacts the lives and activities of people in that region. I've personally been to Morocco, and actually I find Morocco a really interesting country and a vibrant country, but it's really in a sea of trouble around it. The neighborhood there is very, very difficult with Libya, Syria, Tunisia, and various other countries really in a very difficult place. So I think for the investment purposes, North Africa today is somewhat off the map of the investors, and that's it's a tragic position. Hopefully over time we can get back to some kind of peace and normality in the Middle East and North Africa.
Alongside that geopolitical tension is obviously what Matsi was mentioning, and that is the structural unemployment we're seeing globally, not only in Africa, and income disparity. Very close second and third to the major concern on the geopolitical front. Nkosana?
Yes, I actually would like to try and give you a slightly different take on what's going on in the Middle East and
We
North Africa.
welcome a different take.
You see, from a purely scientific perspective, all change must go through a stage of trauma. And I think part of our challenge here is to understand that things cannot change from what they were to something else without going through the stage of something that is uncomfortable. And I think our challenge is to understand and accept that as a process for a start. And also have a way of measuring a realistic time frame that it will take for the old system to settle into a new system. And I think part of our worries are completely unrealistic. Either we have the system stay as it was, or we have the system change to something else and accept that it has to go through some unsettled time.
So you're saying we've got to be quick on our feet effectively and nimble as we navigate the future.
I think if I can say the question that's really being asked out there is not whether it should change, but rather is it going to change to something better?
No, but look at the language we're using. We're saying societal tensions, rising societal tensions. I'm saying there is a natural process taking place. The words are important. If you say societal tensions, it means you're implying something that is not desirable, something you can engineer out of the process. I'm saying, no, that is not possible.
You're saying that all this will lead to positive change in the end, let's hope.
Provided we've got the staying power.
Provided we've got the staying power, an important point, Ashish.
But I think all of these points really relate to mindset, right? I think we need a mindset shift. What we've seen on the persistent structural unemployment, a lot of our governments have still been focusing on foreign direct investment and large investments which will solve the unemployment issue. That's not going to solve the unemployment issue. What's going to solve the unemployment issue is really nurturing these small and medium enterprises. South Africa is a great example. 65% of our private sector employment is created through SMEs. And 4 out of 5 as startups fail. So if we fix this 4 out of 5 ratio, so I think it's a real startup, it's a real mindset.
But that was a point that was covered in Lagos, was entrepreneurship and how that can help solve youth unemployment, but we need regulation to change in many instances.
We need regulation to change, but we also need the mindset shift, right? And I think we need mindset shift from government. Look, I mean, we're building a very large glass plant in Nigeria. $210 million investment. It's not going to create 210,000 jobs. It's automation. It's going to create very few jobs in that respect. That large investments and large projects will create spin-offs. But the major thing is we need to create an enabling environment for these small and medium enterprises. I think that's the answer.
Let's go to the discussion that we had in Nairobi, and that was around ICT, information communications and telecommunication, I believe. IT can change the landscape. It can equal the global playing field. Are we using it extensively? Of course, we've got the Silicon Savannah in Kenya, which is leading the way or leading the charge on the continent.
We should be using it, but it's not inexpensive. You find that also the rate at which it's developing in our country is not fast enough, and hence it's so expensive. So we really need to invest in infrastructure that is enabling for entrepreneurship to flourish. For example, you'll find a lot of small businesses do not have premises to work out of because it's expensive. So a lot has to happen structurally, and I agree with Ashish when he says that it's a mindset that has to change from the government and also from the entrepreneurs themselves. That perhaps the government's job is to create that enabling environment. But you as an entrepreneur, you need to ensure that you have the skills, you have the tools. You need to reach out and see, because South Africa is very fortunate relative to various other sub-Saharan African countries. But when you look at the total activity in terms of entrepreneurship, it's still lacking relative to Botswana, our neighboring countries. So we have the opportunities, we have the resources, but entrepreneurs need to go out there and go get them themselves. So it goes both ways. Government has to provide that enabling environment, but the entrepreneurs also have to engage.
Ahead of this debate in the Southern African region, the World Economic Forum has highlighted that this perceived lack of values in leadership is applicable to the Southern African region. Colin, let's get your thoughts. Goldman Sachs has obviously just put out that report, South Africa 20 years down the line. What are your thoughts on leadership and what we need to take us going forward?
Well, I think that the question firstly is there leadership in society? Is there a depth of leadership? I think certainly there's an increasing depth of leadership in the sub-Saharan Africa continent as a whole. In South Africa, I think we're blessed with depth of leadership. The question is whether leadership is going to be bold enough to take the decisions that are necessary, and therefore what are the areas in which we need the leadership to take place. So the report, for example, identifies the area of the public administration, particularly the areas of education and health, as areas where we just need the basics done better. We need to get management to deliver on the excellent resources that are being put into the education and health sector, and at the moment we have failing outputs. And so we need tough decisions made, for example, taking accountability for teachers who are not teaching properly or are not in the classroom enough, principals who are not present, administrators not doing their job. They need to be made accountable, and that takes some tough leadership in terms of a joint accountability between the employed and the employer to make sure that that takes place. And in South Africa, the government has to, come down more heavily in terms of holding to account the people who are employed in the public service. So yes, they get their salaries, but they're actually required to get the outputs, raise the bar, because we cannot afford wasted investment. So that's one example.
So you don't think there's a perceived lack? I'm going to drill down extensively into this topic, because this is what we've been tasked with today, to come out with a solution at the end of it. You don't believe that there is a lack of value or values in our leadership?
Well, I think lack of values comes down to, for example, corruption would be at one end of the spectrum. People. The other area is, are people underperforming, or they are being held to account for low performance? So that's quite a controversial debate as to how do you hold accountable some fairly lowly paid public worker for what they should be doing, and the cost of not holding them accountable, because what you've got is you've got children, or you've got health patients who suffer as a consequence of not holding those people accountable if they're underperforming. So we need to find this balance. I would hope that we're going to act towards raising the bar dramatically in this area.
We need to raise the bar.
I think we have the leadership. I just think they need to be much more confident about exercising their leadership and taking tough decisions.
Same thing to you, Nkosana. Perceived lack of values in leadership. Your interpretation.
I suppose I'm in agreement with Colin slightly, and again I'm going to put a slightly different twist to this. Who are leaders? Are they out there on their own, or are they like a mirror that in fact is a reflection of we as society at large have become? What framework do we use for defining success? What things are we celebrating which then lead us to say that one is successful, that one is a leader? Is this more an indication of a cancer within society as opposed to the leaders who are representative of what society has become? That's the way I would like to try and look at it, because I think if we just push it out as its leaders, we're taking ourselves out of the issue. We're saying, I'm okay, he or she is not okay. I don't think it's that simple. I think we collectively...
Leaders are a product of society.
I think so. I think they're a reflection in many ways of what we collectively as society have become.
Ashish.
Yeah, no, I think, look, as society, we put them in their positions. We elect them, we put them there. I think what's lacking is that point that Colin touched on, is the accountability. Are we really holding them accountable? And do we have the right to? Absolutely. Do we need to do more of that? Absolutely. Look, I agree with you that this is a concern, like a lack of values in leadership. However, at the same time, saying that, the other side of the coin is that we can't generalize. We're seeing a lot more governance coming into the system in a lot of our countries.
Well, let's turn this on its head and say, what values are we looking for in leadership?
Transparency, honesty, dedication and commitment to actually executing what they're there for.
For the greater good and not for self-interest.
Exactly, because we're, as the people, are actually putting them in those positions. So what do we expect out of them? We expect them to do what they've been elected to do, right? So I think it is accountability, it's transparency, it's governance.
But what happens? How do you explain a situation where before we put them there, we know what they are like and we still put them there?
Now you're asking the difficult questions.
Bronwyn, I just feel that there are good leaders. We have perfect examples we have a very great financial system. So great leaders were able to make sure that we were faring decently in terms relative to other countries on the globe in terms of our financial stability. We've got bad leaders. South Africa is second to the worst in terms of the education system. So it's what do we do with those leaders that are bad, that are causing the cancer within our society? And, we constantly have to promote being active citizens. As a young person, one of the few things that I'm doing is encouraging young people to actually vote. Because there you're able to cast your vote and ensure that you have a say as to who makes the policies, who gives the moral direction or the moral compass of where our society is going. So I just think that we have to be a bit balanced as to say that give credit to those people that have done well.
And Matsu, you point out a very valuable point, because this concern is skewed to the youth.
Indeed.
The youth feel that leadership does not exhibit the right values, more than people who are over 50. If we put below 50 and over 50, or under 40 and over 50.
Sure. Well, I think for me, I can commend a lot of leaders in our country, but then on the same side, I can also, reprimand a couple of leaders that have not done well. But as
so what's the solution? Accountability.
Accountability, and ensuring that you actually vote in the leaders that will stand for your values, as a young person, as an old person, as a citizen of this country. Yeah.
But let's be honest, right? In this case, we're saying this at the same time because of the youth's perception. We're still, even as youth, are going to generalize, right? So the practical thing is, coming back to your earlier point, is ICT. It's bringing in technology so people can actually have a voice in the true sense. And I think in technology, we should not underestimate the fact that we have truly, as a continent, been able to leapfrog, right?
Right, now remember that the other concern, and again it is stressed in this Global Agenda Outlook, is that many have the perception that technology is one of the reasons we're going to see greater unemployment, because automation leads to the loss of physical jobs, human capital. It's not the reality though, because, and I like the example again that I found in the report, is that if you take an e-toll or something that has been automated, imagine the jobs that have been created in creating the software for that automation. That's how we've got to start looking at this. Actually, sorry, I interrupted your train of thought there.
No, absolutely. I mean, look, we run Africa's largest IT services business, right? Offshoring has been a hot thing in IT. We created an onshoring strategy and are able to create that employment locally. BPO space is a huge space that's growing. We're able to compete with India in 9 countries across Africa. So ICT does not remove jobs. It is a way of sophisticating the society, and it has to happen. We cannot ignore that. But I think there's going to be a lot of indirect spin-off from that.
I just want to get back to the youth issue. At Minds, we've got a dialogue series where we engage with young people. And I have to say, I fell into the trap of generalizations, and a couple of young people took me to task. And they said to me, so explain to me, when you use the categorization, collective categorization of the young, what do you mean exactly? Which young? Is it urban young? Is it rural young? Are they do they talk to each other? And I found myself having to rethink. So point number 1, to just take on board. Point number 2, when you look at the behavior of young people, especially in terms of elections and governance, go to any African election where there is violence, and you'll find that the foot soldiers of that violence are young people. So when you say to me, young people and the values they stand for, what are those values exactly?
Are you asking Matsi? You better get ready to respond.
No, because I put these two.
I can see what's going to happen.
We're going to attack.
I put these two in the young youth category.
I'm glad.
But I mean, I'm doing that in order to help us be a bit more rigorous in our analysis.
Sure.
Because the truth, the way you are correct, is that the future of Africa, by and large, lies with young people. If they clarify what kind of Africa they would like to see and mobilize and act collectively, their numbers imply that they can determine what happens. But let's just be clear, there is no such monolithic body with a common purpose, common value systems called the youth. There isn't.
Right of response on either front?
I mean, look, you cannot generalize, right? So I agree that the youth, but it's fueled by the elder people, but that's besides the point. But I think coming back to the practical side, how do you actually give the young people a voice? It's all well and good that we want to hear them, we want to listen to them, and genuinely that is going to be technology. Mobile telecommunications, giving them a platform to speak of.
Why should they be given by somebody? Why don't they give themselves a voice?
But there's also, Ashish, there's also the threat here, because as much as technology is changing the way that we communicate, one of the biggest threats here is cyber war, misinformation as a result of that heightened technology capability. And I'll take an example that we referred to in Nairobi. That was when we saw the Westgate scenario happening, or furore unfold. We had miscommunication over Twitter, over the internet, Facebook, etc., that soldiers were looting Westgate shopping centre, when actually the reality, and the government dealt with this post the event, and in terms of setting the record straight, the soldiers were actually going into the stores to provide water for the wounded and people who were trapped in the shopping centre. So yes, it is a solution, but it also creates a new problem down the line, that how do we insulate the global economy, the regional economies, from this threat of cyber war. Let's just use that dramatic term.
Can I just take a step back, because I think the original question was the trustworthiness of leadership.
Yes, thank you for bringing us back on point.
I just want to make the point. I think it's quite a laden headline, and you know, for practical purposes, it could be quite philosophical, but for practical purposes, we have to acknowledge there's not one leader in society. There are many leaders, and leadership is devolved, particularly in a modern society like we have, say, in South Africa. It's devolved to those running schools, to the people in the school committees, to the unions, to the business leaders, and then there's public servants. And you know, most often it's the president of the country that gets all the attention and the fingers pointed. And I just think we mustn't point fingers so much. We must look to, you know, our own worlds. Where in our own worlds can we change behaviors? Can we take action? So on unemployment, I mean, I think when you look at the numbers, so we've got roughly, you know, 14 million people working in South Africa, 7 million people not, 70% of whom are youth not working. And we can't abandon, you know, 3 or 4 million people who have no hope of skilling themselves in the next, say, 10 years. So we have to work out ways to increase the potential for employment to take place that may be contributed towards by technology, but it's not going to be a technological solution. It's going to be, you know, getting our mining and manufacturing much more revitalized. It's going to be getting innovation, creating the new Capitex, the new discoveries of the future.
This is across sub-Saharan Africa.
In South Africa and then in sub-Saharan Africa. Look what MTN did. MTN created a $20 billion equity value in 10 years through the creation of MTN Nigeria, and they own half of the subscriber population in Nigeria. That's one example where they've created huge amounts of jobs, huge amount of capital investment, huge amounts of infrastructure. And so, you know, we have to look at our own world in business, for example. How do we help create those jobs? How do we help unleash that? What are the costs that we have to bear because government imposes costs on business? And then negotiate and speak to government about, we want to lower the barriers to business and job creation through them, you know, playing ball with us on those regulatory aspects.
Is the closest we get to a silver bullet for everything education?
Well, I think it's one of those things, in my view, education is a precondition for a successful society, but it's not a sufficient condition. And so the higher skilled we are, you look at South Korea, how skilled that society is, the technology they have available, the education that they have available there. It just means the average capability of the resources is much higher. But don't forget, even in South Africa, where 50% of our population who are working don't have matric, that we have a very good productivity per unit employer production rate, in fact one of the highest in the emerging market world.
I just want to go back to a point that you made, which I think is very valuable, because I think we were losing track there and in terms of leadership. And you're right, it is not about saying that leadership, we're only looking at the politicians, the presidents of the country. It's across the board, as you say. We've got to delve into leadership in the same way, in Nkosana, that you were forced to delve into youth. When you talk about that grouping, what do you actually mean? So perhaps we can explore that a little further.
Yeah, but just to, closest to a silver bullet, education, I actually think it is the case. And the reason is the following. We started talking about the way we choose leaders. Education allows you to make informed choices for a start. In other words, you begin to communicate in a manner where you can mobilize with clarity of what it is you're trying to do. And also, just in terms of
I don't want to interrupt you, but talk about Zimbabwe in this case.
In what
which
respect?
Is your highly educated population, incredibly good schooling system,
yep.
And they produced President Mugabe.
No. did they no, but
no, Colin, I thought you were the balancing act here.
That's your interpretation of what happened in Zimbabwe. So here's my interpretation of what's happened in Zimbabwe.
Let's hear
Zimbabwe as a country is afloat today only because of education. Because the population has been able to look after itself in spite of the government. Yeah? And that's a key issue. Second component is that the results, what you see as outcomes of elections needs to be drilled down a little bit more in terms of what did the people really vote for, and what has been announced may not necessarily be the same thing. So don't take the one as linear from the one to the other, and I leave it at that in terms of.
Colin, you have right to respond, sir.
My only point is, education, I agree, is vital,
Yeah.
but it's not necessarily a condition for fulfillment of democracy in society. And so Zimbabwe is a case in point where it's actually a very successful education environment as far as I'm aware.
Yeah.
But the society is in a great amount of pain.
The only thing of disagreement is you said educated population, they produce President Mugabe. That's a little word. I mean, they produce President
Nkosana
Mugabe.
drills down into the word.
Yeah.
All right, so where are we now? We've just said, and Nkosana's put in there, that education is as close to a silver bullet as we can get. I want to be
Yeah,
very careful on the wording,
absolutely.
as we can get. As close to a silver bullet as we can get.
I'm more leaning with Colin on this one. I think it is important, it is crucial, but I don't think it's the be all and end all. And I think also, again, drilling more into the education system, I think the type of education system we create also needs to be tweaked in terms of there needs to be more practical, vocational side of it coming into the education system. So I think
Internships.
if we create that, then education, I would then start saying, is a bit more of a silver bullet.
But the thing is, a more informed society is one that would be able to elect, leaders that they deem would be able to really run this country. I made the effort.
Again, don't limit the leaders to government.
Yeah.
Sure, leadership, whether it's civil
Private
society,
sector,
private
civil
sector.
society.
Yes, because I took the effort of reading the National Development Plan, and as a young person, I got very excited because. In 2030, I'll be 46 years old. I'm a custodian of what is now being deemed the national plan of development for our country. So for the youth that are not reading those kind of policies, that are actually speaking as to what direction in terms of health, in terms of education, they're not going to be informed. They're going to rather see the negativity of what's happening in society, not knowing that for this plan to actually take effect, you have to play a role as a youth of today and as a leader of tomorrow. So those are the fundamental things that only people that value education, that value information, that value reading would actually be able to see that, okay, there is hope. I think the president of the African Development Bank was very optimistic about the fact that this region of the world is quite excited and optimistic about next year's outlook, the global outlook. It's because of, as a South African, I always tell people that I'm a Mzansi optimist, besides being an Afro-optimist. There's a lot of reason to be unhappy about a lot of things, but I know the back ends and starts with me. If I want to be a successful entrepreneur, I'm going to defy the odds, defy the barriers, the red tape. I'm not going to see that. I'm going to go forward and I'm going to sell. I'm going to find a market. If it doesn't exist, find another market.
So Matsi, when are you going to put yourself up for
President.
We're going to a short commercial break. We're back with more insights from our panelists. Welcome back to this World Economic Forum CNBC Africa special broadcast focusing on the outcomes of the Global Agenda Outlook for 2014 and how it relates to Southern Africa. So let's move on to the other task we've been given, and that is the diminishing confidence in economic policies. Colin, in light of the report, again, that you have just put together, I think this is an appropriate starting point for you.
Sure. The fiscal and monetary discipline that's been in place actually since 1994 has been part of a menu of remarkable success. And we've tripled the economy in South Africa as a result. We've brought down inflation. We haven't dealt with, most interestingly, your two top issues other than North Africa, which is persistent structural employment and income inequality. And so going forward, that is a major issue. Right now we have in South Africa, some waning fiscal indicators which are concerning, particularly the current account deficit, which has gone up to 6.8% this week, and with it the rand has weakened significantly, and it's very much the conveyor belt and the shock absorber of the interpretation of the market of these events. So we're going to have to up the game on the fiscal and monetary side as well. Sub-Saharan Africa generally, and Southern Africa itself, is a good neighborhood effect, a good wind blowing through the region growing at sort of 5.5%, South Africa growing at 2%, growing to 3% next year. And so there's a bit of a wind at the back in the region, which is important for us all to take advantage of. Obviously, the relationship with China and the relationship with Africa is important, and the growth of the United States next year would be good. So it's not all bad news, but there are certainly some worrying aspects to the extent that the quantitative easing paring back, which most commentators expect to happen around March, April next year, to the extent that happens, is going to produce a much iller wind around emerging markets, and South Africa at that point in time is going to have to really respond.
Perhaps we need to put the diminishing confidence in economic policies in context, and that is the 2008 financial crisis, which basically took the carpet out from everybody's feet. Then the slow pace of the recovery has added to people's skepticism about where we are going from a policy perspective. That now sets the context. Is that the reason you think people are less confident about the regulatory economic policies in sub-Saharan Africa and Nkosana?
I think it is the reason. And, I mean, put another way, what we're looking for and what we're not getting are not the same. So it means what if we're using a particular model and it's not delivering the results that we're looking for, then we have to go back to basics and re-examine whether the relationships we expect or the relationships we thought held actually still hold. Let me try to explain from, again, a scientific point of view. If I get a piece of rubber band and I stretch it, we understand that there will be a relationship between the force I apply and the degree to which it stretches. The only problem, though, is that in pure science, we understand that that relationship is valid within certain parameters, beyond which it will break down. In economics, there doesn't seem to be the same rigor in terms of explaining within what range these relationships hold. Either there is no rigor or we just don't know. But what is clear today is that the framework we're using is not delivering the results that we're looking for. And therefore, I think there is justification in questioning the model and saying, let's look for a different configuration of how these economic laws relate in order to produce the correct results, given where we are today.
All right, now let's look at this in another light. Are unrealistic expectations being put on economic policies in light of what we've been through, including the financial crisis and the slow recovery?
I think it's not unrealistic expectations. I think there are a lot of practical expectations, but also at the same time, I think, again, as sub-Saharan Africa, we are 46 different markets. So regional integration, for example, is not happening at the pace you'd want it to. And a lot of our economic policies start banking on, some countries move faster than others in a regional integration process. And then when the others don't move on par, then the whole thing gets a little skewed. And we're seeing this in so many different markets. And then multiple regional integration programs overlap, and that creates a whole conflict. So I think on a practical note, I don't think unreasonable expectations are being put out, but I think at the same time, we're not really balancing what is actually required and how and which pace across the countries. I think, the growth in sub-Saharan Africa has been fantastic. Obviously, South Africa is and we're talking about Southern Africa, so I'm allowed to say this, but South Africa's obviously growth is not as high as the rest, and therefore we balance out on a whole. But generally, that is a good sign, but there are certain things which are still lacking.
Structural unemployment, Colin referred to, and income inequality being your next top two concerns in the global agenda outlook. Again, just putting it into context below that war perspective, or the geopolitical issues in North Africa and the Middle East, which everybody is concerned about. Can economic policy help us change structural unemployment and perhaps close that income inequality gap?
Sure, I think the reason why we have inequality is because a lot of people on our continent are not skilled. We have Nkosazana Zuma constantly saying that Africa needs a skills revolution. We need to be very specific as to what skills. Apparently there is a Human Resource Development Council that's assessing what skills does the continent need. So until we upskill our youth, until we upskill the people that live on this continent, it's not going to be easy for us to say that, okay, well, the economic framework that we're living within is effective or not. And another thing I'd like to add is we constantly have to reassess what we have put in place. For example, SADC has been around for a while. We have to reassess what is that relationship like. South Africa is deemed as the bully of the South. So we need to reassess the value that we're adding towards this region, SADC as well. Those kind of frameworks and policies that drive, that do contribute towards the economy of the continent, we have to have that constant re-engagement. And is it working? Because maybe that is the foundation or the fundamental flaws that we have to constantly reassess.
Are there key policies that are fundamental to stronger economic growth?
Absolutely, absolutely there are. And I think the South Africa report we produced demonstrated, if we are able to effectively get to 5% growth rate in the next 20 years, we should be able to bring the unemployment rate down by about half. And that would envisage us increasing the mining and manufacturing sector, as I talked about earlier, through a lighter touch regulation approach, effectively attracting more investment. Number one, absolutely doing the basic things right in regards to public administration, health, education, getting much greater cooperation between labour and business in terms of productivity, and just really focusing on those things. So making marginal improvements can have quite a significant impact, both in the short term, but more particularly in the longer term, over the aggregate growth that we experience. So I don't think, and Nkosazana's point, which I think is the right point, that I don't think we need to go back and completely reevaluate our economic policies. I think we have the right set of economic policies. The question is how we're implementing and how we effectively administering those policies in practice, and the partnership between the social partners. We need to have confidence that we're going to be able to implement and be effective.
Who's leading the charge? And I'll open it up to anybody who wants to take this, including you, Colin. Who's leading the charge when it comes to the right economic policies in place for the betterment of the population within their territories in sub-Saharan Africa? Can I throw out Rwanda, potentially? I mean, why are we seeing Rwanda starring in most of the competitive reports out of the World Economic Forum as one of the easiest territories to do business with within sub-Saharan Africa? Ashish, looks as though you want to take this one?
No, I mean, I agree. I think Rwanda is a fantastic case study of ours. And what upsets me is when people start then justifying it by saying it's a smaller market and when it's this and it's that. But it's not. I mean, 19 years ago.
They've come out of the 1994 genocide and completely turned that economy on
I was
its
a
head.
refugee during that genocide. I saw what it's been through. And in 19 years, what the leadership has done has been amazing. And I think we need to celebrate that. And we need to kind of look at that as a case study, regardless of the economy size or regardless of that. The leadership has been outstanding. So I think we do need to kind of look at some of those cases and learn from it.
Nkosana, anything else you'd like to
You
throw
see,
in there?
it's fascinating, the question you ask, and I'm not an economist, so common sense, okay? Economic policies, in many ways, are an instrument. The intention, in terms of where the leadership's attention is focused, I think will dictate or determine what instruments they deploy. And I think going all the way back to our value system issue, when I look around, at least this sub-region, and I look at the ordinary African who is not getting service or getting attention, the impression I get is that, and I'm going to almost like put myself in a corner here, but the leaders we've chosen, okay? That the leaders we've chosen are focusing on the wrong things. And if they are focusing on the wrong things, they may be deploying the correct instruments for the segment that they're focused on. But they are missing the bulk of the population, and therefore the instruments that are being deployed are focusing on a minority, the most outspoken urbanites, and so on and so on. But the bulk of African populations other than South Africa are in the rural areas. Now, we talk about a disconnect, education and skills, but is it really true? Most African economies, if I went into an average African country and focused on agriculture, for instance, not necessarily to stay stuck in agriculture, but sequentially have clarity that I'll start with agriculture. I'll put a lot of investment in agriculture. How many more people can I absorb in agriculture? Or how many more people are already in agriculture who I can empower to be more productive without a huge upskilling issue? I suspect we could actually achieve a lot. So there is a disconnect between the things that we think are important because of who makes the most noise and the way our attention is really needed from leadership.
Matsi, if I can get you to come in here, which economic policies are you most confident in?
Well, I would say the National Development Plan, in terms of, well, the IPAP as well. So, I mean, for me, I'm quite enthusiastic about what South Africa has put in place in terms of, but the ability to deliver that is at times questionable, I must say.
Right, we're going to turn to our audience at this stage, and if you can stand and state your question, request from the director, please go ahead, sir.
Good afternoon, and thank you to the panel. My name is Shingai Ngara, and I'm a consultant. I'm very excited about the debate because I think it's one of the few that is asking the right questions. And I think two words that are key for me is the question of things being structural and the broad view of leaders as opposed to just presidents. And if we take an Eastern or a Western view. So in the East, with China, you have the authoritarian capitalism driven by the Chinese Communist Party, or a Western view where I'm going to simplify society into public sector, the academy, and private sector, where you have a lot of players who are very consistent amongst that. So 3 US Secretaries of Treasury, Rubin, Summers, and Paulson, so 2 from Goldman Sachs, then go to become US Secretary of Treasury. Larry Summers goes on to become president of Harvard. So there's a synchronicity in either model, the East or the West model, of all the key decision makers that are driving the society forward. Now, I view that the Southern African leadership model is completely fragmented. So you've got the private sector driving one road, a very possibly narrow road. You've got the academy maybe in an ivory tower sort of sense. And then you've got the public sector again. And so I think this fragmentation of the leadership construct, I think goes a long way towards us not being able to address things structurally as a structural leadership issue. And I'd just like to get your comment on that.
Let me open up, Nkosana. You know, if you don't want to answer something, you mustn't look at me. Everyone else looked down, and you came directly to me.
It's interesting because I absolutely agree with you. And let me explain it from a slightly different perspective in terms of the history of Southern Africa specifically. Most of our countries have got a pre- and a post-independence period. Pre-independence, the private sector was synonymous with the enemy. And in our fight for freedom, we internalized and got socialized to regarding the private sector as part of territory which was justified to sabotage. And I think what you are pointing out is a subconscious continuation of an ambivalence that results from that. So when you look at policy formulation in Southern Africa, you find that the public sector will make noises which imply that they are responsible for the whole economy and the facilitation for economic growth. But the actions still speak to the past. That's what's happening in Southern Africa specifically. I am not going to pretend to understand the dynamics in other parts of but I think Southern Africa needs to really grapple with this issue of we are still living in the past in terms of how we regard our responsibilities, where the public sector is public sector for everybody. We are still partial public sector.
Colin, you want to add, and then we'll go to our next question.
I agree. It's a great question, and I agree with Nkosana's answer. I also think it's sort of, if you took it to its logical extent, you could say the liberators saw the private sector as the enemy, and post-liberation, they saw the private sector as the liberating force of jobs, economic activity, social activity, and so on and so forth. At the other end, I've spent a lot of time in China, and you know, it wouldn't be the expectation of somebody in the market to say, if you're going to have a state-led economy, we just want to see the state-owned enterprises do their jobs well and implement ruthlessly, like is the case in China. Well, actually, that's what we need in South Africa. What we need in South Africa is if we're going to have these big 100% subsidiaries of the state-owned enterprises playing a big role in the economy, we want to encourage them to be successful. So we want to make sure that the managements, the boards, and the operations of those entities are successful. If they're not successful, then they must make way for the private sector to do their job. So in a way, that Chinese model is ironically the one where the government has effectively sold off in China significant stakes in those state-owned enterprises. Although the government controls the managements and the boards, they've actually privatized significant amounts without losing control. And so that's an interesting question. Why in South Africa do we require 100% owned state-owned enterprises and we don't deliver as ruthlessly as the Chinese do, having privatized and IPO'd their own companies? And why are we different?
Thank you, Colin. Go ahead, sir.
Hi, Daniel Milan. I'm from the University of Stellenbosch Business School and also a member of the World Economic Forum's Global Agenda Council on Values, so predictably a question about values. If you look at the list of top trends, values is at number 7. But my argument or statement, I'd like to hear the views of the panel, is that the values issue is really the only one that underpins all the other. So you can't really talk about tension in the Middle East without talking about trust and accountability. You can't talk about growing income disparities without talking about inequality or fairness. And so the list goes on. Cyber threats have to do with privacy, climate change with respect for the planet, stewardship of the planet. So question to the panel is would they agree that not trying to push from number 7 to number 1, but that you can't really talk about any of the other issues without a serious discussion about values, also when you start looking at more practical solutions.
Ashish?
Yeah, no, I think values is an absolutely underpinning element for everything. And I think it's not only for the public sector, it's also for the private sector. I think values and ethics and how we go about things is crucial in all elements of society. And I think there needs to be a more emphasis on how we kind of create that awareness around it. But values is crucial, and I think it's both public and private.
Matsi, you're agreeing with that?
Well, I am agreeing in that, and I would like to add that there has to be a point of symmetry, which is what the World Economic Forum is trying to achieve, and various other platforms that are trying to engage civil society, government and private sector. So I might feel that instead of values, I value more skills or education. A lot of people would tend to have core things that actually hold everything together. So it's finding that path of symmetry within all these deliberations and various themes that are going to be prominent in the next year.
I'm going to make us all comment on this. So Nkosana and then Colin.
Yeah, complicated. Complicated because when we say values, and we use a label like values, we imply a universality. The problem is that the current economic model that we are operating has got embedded within it the concept of competition as an absolute fundamental. And therefore, the fascinating issue here is about how values play competition or vice versa. I mean, let me give you a couple of simple illustrations of this. So, transparency, honesty, and all of that. Now look at the current debate about spying. Where does it fit in the values and in competition? And look at the way the Australians have reacted. Say, guys, what are you getting excited about? Everybody does this. So where does it fit in the value system? I can understand it from a competition perspective. But in terms of fair play and the like, you would struggle to place it. So I think values, yes, provided you understand that there is what I would call a complication of the economic model that we operate in, which is got embedded within it competition. And as you know, they say all is fair in what?
Love and war. And let's hear it from the audience.
I was just going to add, if you look at value creation, it's an interesting combination of words. Question is, us moving from 2 million people being on social welfare to 16 million people being on social welfare, is that a good or a bad thing? Well, actually, it's essential for South Africa that we provide the social welfare net. But there are going to be various people that look at that and say, is that sustainable? Is it a proper use? Are we creating a welfare society? But for the 16 million who are getting those cash grants every month, it's absolutely survival. And so, this is the problem with values and morality, is it depends on whose glass you're looking through to see where it's coming out.
Yeah.
And I think South Africa, for example, or Southern Africa, in getting to that more, structural sort of agreement, has to have more of a shared value system as to what is valuable in the society.
Next question, thank you.
Good afternoon. My name is Anita Soni. I serve on the advisory board of the South African Black Entrepreneur Forum, and myself an entrepreneur for more than 30 years. Just looking at some of the top 10 trends, and if you look at the 2 recurring trends that comes out in terms of the outlook on the global agenda for 2014, is the issue around widening income disparities and unemployment. It's a recurring theme, irrespective of whether you're in the Southern Hemisphere or the Northern Hemisphere. It's a recurring theme. Now, having said that, my question really is, and leaning more towards the stance Mr. Moyo was taking earlier on, is where exactly does the responsibility lie?
So, let's whip around. You're going to comment on this one, and Matsi, we're going to start with you. Is it government's responsibility to create the bridge when it comes to income disparity?
Government's responsibility is to create the framework, so creating the policies that will enable an enabling environment. And then private sector, for example, in the entrepreneurship development space or small business development space, it is their responsibility to ensure that they are supporting small businesses within their supply chain. So I feel that the response to that question is that everybody has a role to play. government, an enabling environment, private sector, create an enabling environment for small business to be able to supply. And that being that you have to actually invest at the core. You cannot expect for small businesses to especially black small businesses, to participate in your value chain you need to invest in their development, in the sustainability of them providing within your supply chain.
Ashish?
No, I agree with that. I mean, just to build on that, I think it is a public-private partnership kind of method in terms of we do need the enabling environment and we do need the right public policies. However, the private sector needs to kind of determine also what is required in order to create that right enabling environment. So I think it is a combination. I mean, the private sector cannot do it without the public sector and vice versa. I think it's a complete partnership model.
Nkosana?
So I think let's try to use an example of which countries do we think that have done well, and how do we understand how they've got to where they are. For me, the two countries which keep coming to mind, I would look at Germany in a particular phase of the sort of the national development, and I look at Japan. And I find those nations easy to understand in the context or context of a country X incorporated. And what that seems to say to me is that you get the different parts of the society able to come together in order to define the objectives in the first place collectively. It's not a question of the one doing it and then handing over to the other to say, perform within this framework. But that they've got processes, for whatever reason, which have allowed them to be able, at the very beginning of the process, to consult and therefore own the outcomes of defining the objectives, own them collectively. What that does is that as they implement and the tensions arise, as they will arise between the public and the private sector and civil society, they will absolutely arise. It becomes easier for them to sit around a table and have a dialogue which says, you have to give here, you have to give here in order for us to continue to deliver on what we agreed at the beginning. So I think there is a process issue about how you set the national aspirations and how those become owned by everybody, and then divvy out the responsibilities of delivering on that.
I quite like that in terms of execution. Colin?
It just strikes me that the two biggest economies in the world, China and the United States, provide the polarities of how they're attacking it. China, a $9 trillion economy, lifting masses of people out of poverty, has done it through a state development-led model, but basically used a modern market-based model to get those state-owned enterprises to deliver the infrastructure, the increased living patterns, and so on. The United States has effectively created a high-skilled, highly technologically, highly entrepreneurial-led model, and we in South Africa have bits of both. And so we are trying to, I think, try and find the balance between our very modern financial market, our modern capitalist economy, and on the one hand, on the other hand, a state model that that we're trying to borrow to an extent. And I think we need to up the game. We actually have been effective to date in creating middle class. We have been effective in supporting the poor, and we have moved people up into the upper band, but not sufficiently strongly and not sufficiently effectively over time.
We've got time for closing comments across the board. Now, as we know, the Global Agenda Outlook goes some way to setting the dialogue for what we'll be seeing in Davos at the World Economic Forum in Switzerland come 23rd to 25th of January 2014. Closing comments in terms of the Global Agenda Outlook, the top 10 trends as has been set out in the report. Matsi, your feelings on what is this going to set the stage for Davos in terms of discussion across the global agenda? Is there anything that we're missing?
I feel that the trends that have been highlighted are justifiable. I think that it does have a fair reflection of what's been happening in the past couple of years to then what to look forward going forward. And as an African for the region, I'm quite optimistic, like I said earlier.
Ashish?
I think the overall topics do make a lot of sense. I think obviously as Sub-Saharan Africa, as Africa, we do need to kind of take out a few and add a few more. But I think on the overall theme, I think topics are great, discussions are great. I think really the point is going to be how we action these and how the accountability is going to be kept in place.
Looking for those solutions. Nkosana?
I would agree that the identification of the issues is correct, but I think we need to just get a bit more nuanced in terms of understanding some things that we have to accept as processes with outcomes that again are part of a natural evolution, and those that we can manage and maybe achieve a different course.
Colin, final word.
Just briefly on the world in 2014, I think there's one positive comment and one potential downer comment.
Can you do the downer first?
The downer
End on
first.
the positive.
So the downer first is global emerging markets are going to be in a tough place in the first half of next year. And we're going to have to really be effective in the way we manage that, particularly as the QE pairs back and money flows to developed world away from the emerging market world. And we're part of that. The up is we have a fantastic neighborhood. I mean, growing at 5.5%, there's really no other neighborhood like ours outside of Asia. So we are going to attract a lot of attention from the sovereign wealth funds, from the multinationals, from people looking for superior growth performance. And so South Africa as the engine room of Africa still is the case. Linking in with sub-Saharan Africa, we've got something good going for us.
Well, that brings us to the end of the third and final installment of the World Economic Forum CNBC Africa Global Agenda Outlook Regional Discussion Series. Thank you to my guests, Colin Coleman, the Managing Director, Goldman Sachs Sub-Saharan Africa, and Nkosana Moyo, Founder and Executive Chair of the Mandela Institute for Development Studies. Ashish Thaka, he's the Founder and MD of Mara Group, and Matsi Modise, National Executive Director, South African Black Entrepreneurs Forum. Thank you so much for joining us.